Anyway, I'm certainly honored to be part of this conversation with my old friend, Donna Haraway, and my new friend, Ursula Le Guin. Ursula, I've been reading your work for a long time, and it's seeped into my consciousness in ways that I have only begun really to understand. And most recently, writing that essay that Bettina talked about Ishi, which, as I tracked all the various Ishi stories, and I tried to track up all those that I had access to, the kind of extended family of the Krobers and the world of Berkeley anthropology, which was very much part of that story. And I thought, well, I really must talk about Ursula Le Guin. She's part of at least the extended family. And then, as I started reading and rereading works, you in a nice way hijacked the whole essay, and I ended up writing a lot about you at the end, which I sent to you, and you braced yourself, and then rather graciously told me you liked it, which was an enormous relief to me, believe me. But I hope we can talk about the two works. Well, the two works I wrote about were The Word for World is Forest, her brilliant novella that many of you, I'm sure, know, and Always Coming Home that Bettina talked about. And I hope we can talk a bit about Always Coming Home, especially because it brings us into intimate contact with the world that we're actually in, the world of California. It's the Napa Valley, but Northern California and Oregon, where Ursula lives today. A population, animals, flora, fauna, geology, and human history, which all are deeply part of that world, which may be projected into some sort of notion of the future, but really is about another present, I think, or another kind of present, perhaps. The book Always Coming Home is a wonderful and strange kind of book, and it raises the inescapable question: if it's a work of utopia, a utopian fiction, what kind of utopia is this? Or, more profoundly, is it even possible to conceive of the future, if utopias are supposedly in the future, not here and now? And can we really think about the future concretely? And this is a big question for our conference, which has a kind of historicizing title to it. You know, the latest in a series of geological epochs. Anyway, I'd like to read a favorite passage of mine from your 1982 essay, and I guess it's as close as you ever get to writing theory.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, I think it's within translation range of theory, for sure, but it's not theory. It's not theory the way we're used to it in the academy. I'm happy to report. As you'll see, I'm going to read a passage from it. It's called "A Non-Euclidean View of California as a Cold Place to Be." It's an essay where you imagine a yin way of thinking about utopia is different from a more linear, masculine Western way of imagining ourselves in time's arrow, the utopist, as you call him, narrating, driving, actually on a motorcycle, driving a path forward through time. A cold place to be, this evokes Levi-Strauss's well-known opposition between cold and hot societies. It used to at least be a well-known dichotomy, and where cold would be referred to tribal, aboriginal, indigenous cultures, and in a hot perspective, we're in constant turmoil, zooming ahead into the future for better and for worse, progress and or apocalypse. Cold is slow, but not inert or unchanging, but more rooted in place, I suppose more like plants and trees in the language we're using now. Slower and darker, abandoning the radiant sandcastle of progress, you write, to let our eyes adjust to a dimmer light. Perhaps in this light we can see what's already there in the shadows. Here's the quote. Copernicus told us that the Earth was not the center. Darwin told us that man was not the center. If we listened to the anthropologists, we might hear them telling us, with appropriate indirectness, that the white West is not the center. The center of the world is a bluff on the Klamath River, a rock in Mecca, a hole in the ground in Greece. Nowhere, its circumference everywhere. Perhaps the utopist should heed this unsettling news at last. Perhaps the utopist would do well to lose the plan, throw away the map, get off the motorcycle, put on a very strange-looking hat, bark sharply 3 times, and trot off, looking thin, yellow, and dingy, across the desert and up into the Digger Pines.
Yes.
Whoa. Yeah, exactly. Well, when I read that the first time, I really wanted to cheer. Now, there's theory for you. The unsettling news that Copernicus, Darwin, and yes, I underline, the anthropologists bring, the metamorphosis of the utopist into a critter very much like Coyote, and we just, there's a poem that you didn't read about the Canada lynx walking softly out of sight, or at least out of our sight. For me, your work presumes the decentering of the West that 20th century anthropology was a part of, a difficult part of. And this profound decentering brings the possibility of perceiving alternate paths in the present, oblique and looping destinies. It brings a sense of historical times, plural, of specific temporal scales and embodied experiences of the real, ontologies. These are some of the questions I bring from your work as we think about our survival together and apart in a damaged, transforming world.
So we thought we would each give our brief thinking with Ursula and then open it up. And I told Jim ahead of time that we're both a little starstruck, and that if we were struck wordless, we would have done our job, since neither of us is actually legendary for brevity. So we gave each other permission to kick each other, so that if you see a little of that going on, it's along the lines of collegial and friendly behavior.
Do I have permission to?
Kick?
Yes, well, actually, oh dear, it's worse than I feared.
You can throw stuff. Got any fruit?
So, like Jim, I want to open up the questions of the many times, the many rhythms, the more than one story, the coming to concreteness that is so crucial for what Jim calls big enough stories, that we certainly need to change the story, which Ursula has done many times, as well as written and talked about, the urgent need somehow to tell other stories that have a purchase on the possibility of the life story, of the ongoing story, of the thick present tense, and what it would take to do that, with every imaginable skill and capacity of being with, of ongoing with, that we all could conjure. I think I don't know when I first met Ursula Le Guin's teaching, but I have ordered it in a certain way for the purposes of these 5 minutes. And the carrier bag theory of fiction is certainly another act of theory, Ursula, you must admit, that touched me and has stayed with me in an astonishingly deep way. It made it possible for me to write Primate Visions. In a lot of ways, because the carrier bag, the collecting up of the things of the world that could somehow be shared for the purposes of making living and dying well, the small technologies that make our species what we are, the net bag to carry a kid, to collect some food while chatting with each other, the kinds of socialities and collectings and takings and givings and sharings of the ongoing story, instead of yet one more time the hero prick story and his tragic detumescence. The endless parabola of the conic forms of Galileo, you know? I gave as my job talk on this campus, you remember that Bettina and Jim, also on the committee, hired me a talk on the parabolic forms and his scam, you know, his con, not his con, but his con. Never mind. In the carrier bag theory of
We hired her anyway.
and I blame Ursula because I had already been reading this woman and her kin. I had already been reading James Tiptree Jr. and those writers who shaped me in my molecules. And I quote, I just want to read one sentence out of the carrier bag theory of fiction. So you get up and you go to the damn soggy oat patch in the rain. Wouldn't it be a good thing if you had something to put baby oo in so you could pick the oats with both hands? A leaf, a gourd, a shell, a net, a bag, a sling, a sack, a bottle, a pot, a box, a container, a holder, a recipient. I would like to propose that that is a theory of technology. And I'd like to open up something about the technologies that we need to think about and build and remember and that the questions of stories and technologies co-implicate each other. And it matters which stories tell stories. It matters which thoughts think thoughts. And that the carrier bag theory of fiction, I propose, is a really essential story theory of technology. It's many things. I propose it that way. Now, in her a really amazing little report of the Therolinguists in The Author of the Acacia Seeds, which she read the last section, Anna Tsing and I taught buffalo gals and other animal presences together in a graduate seminar that was Joined Feminist Theory and Theories of Culture. See, you were put there. And we taught these stories under the rubric of geofeminisms. We read, I first read The Author of the Acacia Seeds then with Anna in our efforts somehow to think well about environmentalisms and ecologies and feminisms and stories and storytelling. And one of the sections in there involves the question of the Therolinguists learning to read penguin. For which they had to engage photography because they had, first of all, to understand that the penguins are swimming and that their semiosis, their language, is kinetic and in the waters. If you were going to read penguin, you absolutely must engage the kinesthetics of the dance in all of your technical and poetic and narrative lust and savvy, that the learning to read penguin, the semiosis of the penguin, was this intensely erotic cognitive achievement of the Therolinguists, who were a rather odd lot in this story, it must be said. Not altogether lovable, as the president's report on the questions of whether the plant is communicative or not. I, of course, have been schooled with this beautiful anthropologist and science studies person, Natasha Myers at York University, who is deeply immersed in thinking about what she calls involutionary momentum rather than evolutionary momentum. She is a Darwinist, as aren't we all. Anybody not a Darwinist can leave through the wide open door right back there. There are many ways, of course, to read Darwin, but I am not kidding. Anyway. Seriously. So anyway, I was trying actually to say something about the lyrics of the lichen, and the geolinguist and the vast, the juxtaposition in the same sentence of the incommunicative space, the word, and the vast community. There's this insistence on the implosion of not contradictions, not opposites, but rubbings together of things that don't necessarily rest easily with each other. The word, the emptiness, the community, the concreteness.
Your time is up.
And my time is up. But I get to say one more thing, which is about the word for world is forest. because this is where Ursula Le Guin teaches us at the end, in the mouth of Selver, what the movie Avatar could not face. Which is to say, when the men of the Ecumen tried to say, well, now we're leaving you, everything will be fine, the vast exterminationist, genocidal, colonizing, mining war is over, you can go back to the way you were, we promise we won't show up again. And Selver looks him in his eyes and he says, we cannot pretend any longer that we don't know how to murder each other. Not just kick out the colonist, and that you can't go back inside the dream. And I think all of this conference is in the wisdom of that Selver telling the colonists who thought he could leave, that we can't pretend any longer, we don't know how to murder each other. So the ongoing story, when innocence is not even dreamable, the life story, and how to tell it. I'm done.
Do you want to respond to any of the things we've said? Or shall we feed something to you?
No. Feed.
Your food pellet is coming. Well, I said I hope we could talk a little bit about Always Coming Home, which one, I confess that was the title I wanted for my book, but it was taken. I would have taken that from the last book I wrote. I mean, it's just a terrific processual thing, title. I mean, because one is always coming, never arriving, but the coming home is what it's all about. And I really do think that works for the business of being indigenous or indigenizing today. And I'm an immigrant to California, and I've read some things in which you've described yourself as immigrants, and your parents at least as immigrants, that is to California. And we're not the original people of the state. It's a settler colonial state. But we become indigenous here. There are differential ways of becoming indigenous, and we do this. And I found that Always Coming Home was an enormous resource for me, getting me to unthink what I thought a proper landscape and proper flora and fauna were, which were New England. Right? And to see what's here, and now with your help and with 35 years of being here, I finally started to do it. And that involved making friends with the quail who sometimes allow me to see them in my driveway. But I'm interested in your own life story, if you're willing to talk about it a bit. You're a kid who grew up in Berkeley,
Yeah.
but your family had a summer place in Napa, which was, you've said it in various times and places, was a really formative place for you. And I wonder if you'd be willing to talk about it. And I know in some of your recent poems, you seem to have returned to the house.
I'm always coming
going
home.
Back. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That book was written in that house. My dad bought it's an old 1872 ranch house in the hills above St. Helena. He bought it in 1931 for, the family story is for $1,200 in the Napa Valley. I mean, you can't buy a pebble in the Napa Valley. Anyway, and we just always went there all summer, every summer, when I was a kid. Even during the war, when my brothers were off in service. And it just became that's my center of the world. And so, and I have gone back there, I guess almost every year of my life, at least once, and more than that. So this is a very unusual, in this country, in this time, is that anybody has a place that remains in the family for 3 or 4 generations, and that you can go back to. this is, you know.
Oh, it's unusual.
And then, and California, about California, you know, you're having to get used to it. One does. I mean, this one's born here, because California is biologically an island, you know. It really is different from anything around. And how many plants are there that are such and such Californica? You know, it's isolated by the deserts and the sea. And then up to the north, Oregon and California merge and blend past Ashland and so on, but then the climate changes. So this is a very extraordinary place. I just feel so lucky to have been born here.
Yeah. I wonder whether you now live in Oregon, a different landscape. Oregon.
It's New York.
He's Eastern.
Oregon. I'm practicing. You're in Oregon now, and a lot of Oregon sounds like organs transplant. You're an organ transplant or something.
I'm an immigrant. Yeah.
Has it changed? I mean, you also write about that landscape, the Columbia River, the whole.
Well, in the desert.
The desert,
Oregon's where I
especially.
discovered the desert.
Yeah. How is that? I mean, you want to say something about that landscape in your world?
I said I'm glad I was born in California. I'm glad I live in Oregon. I love the West. And I love writing about the West, and I love reading about the West. This is an amazing place.
Yeah.
It is also barely habitable. You know, in many, water, right from the start. If you don't manage your water in the West, you've had it. And we're getting there.
We're getting there.
Yeah, as you people with the drought know.
Before we leave the connection between your summer place and always coming home, one of the things that struck me reading some of the recent poems you've shared with us is the space of the house. I mean, there's something, there's poems where you return to that house in, now, how do I pronounce Kishamish? Is that it?
Kishamish.
Kishamish, the name of the place, the ranch. There's the house, there's a room in that house. And sometimes the room seems to be enclosing, and sometimes it's hardly there. You know, the houses, and then there are houses, it's a big theme. The house is a big theme as a social space and a cosmological space in Always Coming Home. You know what I mean? And there's sections of poems about houses, and the social structure is built around houses. And I'm wondering if you think, if you have anything, you know, kind of more to say about that, and whether.
There's an awful lot to say about houses.
Yeah.
And particularly by women, and
Yeah.
by women who have kept house, as I did all my life. Also, the house in connection with the whole idea of the container, the basket, the thing that holds things. A house is a place that holds lives, and it holds them away from the rest of the world. Of course, it's protective and so on, and yet it's sort of. A house can be another skin, another body.
And yet it's not like the man's house is his castle. It's permeable. I mean, it's a net bag of sorts, isn't it? I mean, in the way you write about
absolutely.
houses.
Yeah. A house without windows is unthinkable. And
It's a supermax prison.
it's one of those big stores that don't have any windows. So those are horrible places. They really scare me. They really.
Jump in?
Well, I want to stay with it. I want to kind of joining with Jim, think about the plants and animals that are everywhere in your stories and in your poetry. And we were talking at breakfast this morning about what people might want to ask you, and a question that really kept coming up was, how does she keep telling these stories? How does she keep finding the sense of what's going on in the world that touches us? And I think My question in that is how the other critters of the world are part of your ongoing ability to tell stories.
I don't know, Donna. It's partly well, they're here. We're sharing the world with them, and they have stories, and they are part of our story. And I'm interested in them, you know. And so they give me whatever it is that you make stories out of, or poems. But I don't know how that works.
I read a book called Eating Stone recently by a woman who lives near Dinebekea in the Navajo Nation, and who studies the desert bighorn sheep. And the title of her book is Eating Stone. And there were many of your poems that made me think of the intimacy of living with stone and the animals who depend on grazing in the cracks between stones, and the modification of a hoof to be able to be acrobats across stone, and the connections of rhythms and surfaces and lives, and the throwaway, the extraordinary endangered. I mean, these are extraordinarily vulnerable populations of critters. And your poetry feels so evocative to me of your stones have so many layers of meaning for me.
I love rocks. I'm one of these people, wherever I go, I pick up rocks. And, you know, you come home with your suitcase a lot heavier than it was. Then you lay the rocks out, and they're beautiful. Rocks are so beautiful. But then after a while, I actually have a rule about them. When I forget where they come from, they have to go out in the garden. And our garden is going to really interest future geologists very much.
Yeah.
But there's something about a rock. It is a little entity. You hold it in your hand. It's there. It's got weight. It's got presence. It's got color, dignity. And it's going to outlast you like you can't believe. And there's something, you know, you're holding this thing that is, how old is it? You know, even as an entity, even if, yeah.
Well, you're opening up this whole question of different temporalities. And, you know, the poem you read us about the tree burning, as you beautifully put it, but slowly, you know, and then us racing around burning brightly, and the tree outliving us, and you end up with something about when it was a sapling 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've always felt that. I ran into this in Paris in the Jardin des Plantes, and it was there that I discovered trees who I thought of as historical trees, in the sense that there would be this old tree, and the little sign would say, planté en 1720 par le père machin, you know, Jésuite de Chine, you know, and there'd be some Jesuit, someone in China, you know, but brought this seed back, and it was still living, and it was going to outlive me, and it was this contact with the age of discovery, but a living contact, and that's what you know, made me realize that there are different historicities, if you like, because the tree it wasn't so, for me at least, it wasn't so much some sort of natural lifespan. It was the historical, all the things that tree had seen, you know what I mean, that I could recognize as historical, as well as all the other things you bring up, which is the history of the tree, which is the birds it's known, the fires it's survived, you know, all of these things. And that's the sort of vegetable historicity, if you like. And then there's stones, the temporality of stones you were talking about. They outlive us, but
they were here before, and they're going to be there after. Yeah.
So, what is that? There's a poem you didn't read, or did you, in the Borderlands? Do you know the one?
No. Yeah.
Where there's a sense of there's a sense of connection of your soul, I think it was, to stone. The idea that the soul yearns to return to stone. You remember?
Yeah, well, it's a poem, a very old woman's poem about.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are times that I just sort of feel like the parts of me that are stone or star or dust or whatever want to go back. They want to go back and be what they are. And what came together to make me, what's the Houseman poem? From far, from even morning, the stuff of life. I can't say it, but it's the same idea that one is almost an accidental concatenation of a lot of stuff getting together and becoming an entity for a while.
Well, at one level, it's the old dust to dust, but what I got
But
from...
that sounds so gloomy.
That's good. What I loved about that poem and some other ways you've used stones is that these stones, which are a sort of deep contact with the earth in a way, but also put us in direct contact with astronomical time. You know, this earth is a rock among rocks in this enormous space of, and that, you know, that's a different temporality from the one we're even talking about in this conference, which is very much planetary, you know, and the life of a planet, which in this temporality is not exactly trivial, but it's just not.
Well, we can't, isn't the fact, we cannot really imagine very long periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
We really are not equipped to think. I mean, the brain is sort of a practical thing, and it's got to be able to think quickly about now and spread out some when it has the leisure to. But essentially, I cannot imagine how long ago the Jurassic era was. There's no way. I have tried, you know. I cannot imagine it. But maybe that's why I sort of value this contact with something like a rock that's older than the Jurassic, that's been there. And it carries in it that time that it's been here.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I want to change the focus a little bit to the question of technology.
Uh-oh.
And no, I mean, it's not so big a change because I think it involves the way you opened your remarks, the disposable world, the throwaway world, that I get really angry when someone wants to update my system. I feel that it doesn't quite
perfectly
hit
good
the,
system.
it's sort of like, not like the beautiful erotic jazz song that comes most to mind, but you talk really eloquently about science and poetry and so on. Science, poetry, carpentry, all the things we need. You're very sparing when you talk about technology, because I think it's harder to talk about. And I think
But carpentry is technology.
Absolutely it is.
And lots of aspects of science are
And a fish,
highly technological.
and a penguin
Yeah.
swimming in the water is technology. And
Well, no, not to an anthropologist. No.
well, to a biologist.
No, technology means making.
Yeah.
Well, or the organization of skill to accomplish I'm thinking. Well, but that's another kind. Okay, technology. Actually,
The
this
crow with a
maybe
stick.
this-
The crow with a stick. That's technology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
crow with a stick.
If we don't stick to that definition, I think it gets too broad to talk about.
Well, I know what you're saying, but I spend a lot of time with bioengineers and biomolecular engineering folks who study the living world and its connectedness very much as a question of evolutionary engineering, by which I do not mean that they study it teleologically or, best adaptation. It's opportunistic, it's contingent, it's a lot of things, but are really deeply interested in the design dimension, in biodesign.
How it works.
How it works,
Yeah.
truly how it works.
Yeah.
And I think that work, which I find beautiful and ties me to the world in the how like a leaf way, is also very much part of the robo-bee drone to replace the honeybees, is very much part of the biomimetic military engineering world. These connections you're kind of 2 degrees of distance from this extraordinarily beautiful intimacy with the way the biological world is put together to the appropriation of that in a capitalist and militarist scientific system for the technologies of obliteration or replacement. So I find myself really, really needing to stay still with technology a lot. And I know you've been talking to Vandana Shiva, emailing back and
Vandana
forth.
Singh? Vandana Singh?
Oh, I thought I heard
Maybe different Vandanas?
the Vandana who is against GMOs. Shiva. Anyway, doesn't matter.
No.
Different one.
No.
Okay, different person. I misread the email.
Mine's
But, okay,
a young writer named
question's
Vandana Singh.
the question's the same. It's how to think about the technologies among us and your pleasures and displeasures. And I know the pencil is technology too. And we're both against high technology.
Against?
Well, high meaning, the astralized guy in the sky version, really up to the minute.
Well,
Seriously.
until we need to send an email.
No, but why? No. Why call that high technology?
Pretty high.
No, that's a
Compared
problem.
to the pencil.
Anyhow, what gets called high, and do we need to get rid of the word high?
Oh, yeah, well, that's like hard science fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
High, hard, in other words, masculine.
In other words, masculine.
I mean, it's a value judgment snuck into the word. Yeah, but I do think there is a useful, to me, distinction between. You see, what I get tired of is people talking about technology, and they mean the high technology, the recent advances of the last 50, 60 years, and often of the last 15 or 20 years. And there's this complete obliviousness to the fact that most of the sort of basic technologies, like, building, bricklaying, carpentry, sewing clothes, and so on, these are technologies of great refinement that have been worked on for hundreds of years and are absolutely gorgeous. And they're just, they don't count. That's not really technology. Well, the hell it isn't. And I think this is where often science fiction does kind of go wrong in thinking that the only good tech is high tech. So you see, to me, in my line of work, it's a really useful distinction that kind of needs repeating and driving home. Remember that, a wooden floor is a masterpiece of engineering.
I'd like to use high technology for acts of domination, so that some very ancient controls of, let's say, irrigation projects in nation building in ancient worlds that produce structures of domination that astralize that turn the forces of the earth into the sky gods. Certain ways in which very ancient technologies produce the problems we are still living with seem to me, it's the technologies that are about the appropriation of value, and it's for the high gods, for the rulers. I want to use high technology more that way, rather than in relationship to whether it's, say, biomolecular engineering versus carpentry, both of which are technologies.
Well, why not just call it state technology?
Well, I think,
And the high-low is very
we need more than one
metaphysical.
term for these
Yeah.
big things.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, if this is sort of the technology of the high gods, you could call it Jovian or something like that,
Right. Well, or, the word capitalism should make its appearance at a certain
I
point.
believe the word
And,
capitalism should make its
it
appearance.
needs to make its appearance.
Yeah,
Instead of just slithering across among.
yeah. you know? And it's harder to say than Oregon.
Donna has already introduced the phrase capital scene as an alternative to Anthropocene.
Yeah, for all that the Anthropos has really not been a shining example of how to live well, he really didn't do this thing called the capitalist scene.
Well, he did.
Anyway, that's another conversation. But I think high technology is tremendously bound up.
I'd like to hear that other conversation.
No, we'll have
We
it.
do it next year.
And, you know, ending with the snaky, tentacular ones, the thonic ones, the forces of the earth and the seas, blah, 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 who have, you know, incredibly well-designed biobodies and many other things. But you both love and hate. Well, I mean, look at your whiteness poem, the Melville one. The little bit you didn't read was about the watching the screens that are giving you your imitation life.
She read that.
Oh, you read that part too? Okay, I was undoubtedly looking down, wondering what I was going to say. Okay.
Still being on stage, yeah.
And, you know, yeah, well, yes, but. And I'm really curious about your yes, but relationship to IT technologies as well as to I don't know.
Well, remember, they invented them when I was already in my 40s or more, that I didn't grow up with any of this stuff that is now absolutely second nature to my grandson. You know, and so I'm a stranger to this country, and getting into your 80s, you are a stranger in your own land always, I think, but in a fast-moving technological growth society such as we have, you are really estranged, and you cannot expect me to just embrace it and say, oh, isn't it all just absolutely wonderful? I enjoy it.
No, but I really don't think I'm asking you to do that.
All right, better not.
In spades. But I think that you are worried that I might be asking you to be doing that. Actually gets at not being in one's 80s, but perhaps being in Santa Cruz, a town where a lot of people won't vaccinate their kids. Where
We got them in Oregon.
well, maybe good reasons. Right? I'm really interested in the love-hate relationship, the extraordinary fascination and repudiation of the things of science and technology among us, because I think thinking better about that is part of learning to tell the ongoing story in the present tense. I think that having a present tense at all is going to be, we need to develop a much thicker culture for the poetries and the sciences. And I don't know how to do it. You don't know how to. We don't know how to do it. And I read science fiction in part because some of the best storytellers are trying to do it.
Yeah, and it has leaked out marvelously from science fiction into respectability.
Readability. That's bad, that part.
You know, the line between fiction and science fiction is very blurry now, and this is something I've been wanting to see for decades, and it's lovely to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you're part of the reason, literally.
Fine with me.
Okay. Maybe. Go ahead.
I just have one quick question on this technology, and then we were thinking we'll open it
We
up.
might let other people speak.
We'll open
We
it up for
imagine
the
that as a
audience for
possibility.
maybe 15 or 20 minutes. So prepare your short question.
Very short questions. Jim and I have allowed each other to go on a bit. We will not allow the same
Well,
from
we
you.
can't police it. We can't police it, but there'll be many people, so the shorter the better, and the more questions.
And the more specific.
Yeah.
Concreteness.
Lest we think that Ursula is against, you know, a lot of modern technology. In the Always Coming Home, which is a non-industrial society, you know, and a non-capitalist, non-industrial society, something has happened to capitalism and industrialism.
We outgrew it.
We're not quite sure, and we've outgrown it and grown back into.
We survived it.
But you keep, and you know, there are no cars, it's wagons and horses and so forth, but you keep something that feels like an incipient internet
Oh, it's much more than that.
What, the exchange? Well,
Yeah.
would you tell them about the exchange?
Well, I can't really very well. It's, it's sort of embedded in the book, but it is an enormous sort of intergalactic internet. And the thing is that the people of the Valley are not very interested in it. So they don't really know about how far the information extends. It is an information exchange, purely. And that's really about all you know about. And they can go to it and use it the way we use Google. They can essentially. The thing is, living in a very stable society, which is not a growth technology, not growth capitalism, they know how to do most things, so they don't have to keep looking it up.
Now, there is a utopian statement.
Oh, yeah. Shamelessly.
In the usual sense of the term.
Except that there have been a lot of people on Earth who live that way.
Yeah.
They know how to do things.
Well, again, it's already here. What we think of is, I mean, a lot of the arts of living in a damaged planet are already here. And I would say that one of the things I got from that subtitle in the conference and thinking about living in a damaged world, I thought, well, where could we look for tools or examples? And I thought about the people who today tend to be bundled under the term indigenous, tribal, Aboriginal, First Nations, whatever. And these are folks who were all supposed to have disappeared, like Ishi, who stood for them all. Why? Because their worlds had been destroyed. Well, but they have, in fact, transformatively survived, and they have been living in a damaged world now for quite some time. And people who think in the sort of ecological vein, put it that way, go to indigenous people for wisdom about living close to the earth and for Mother Earth and all those things. But I think now we need to perhaps go to them, or at least converse with them, about how you live in a world that has been destroyed.
I would just add to that an absolute agreement that if you want to go to a people who know how to live in a world that's been destroyed, go to any American Indian. Their world was destroyed. And most reservations are extremely poor places, although, of course, the casinos have changed things a lot. And they are living in a damaged world and surviving.
Right. And you have
My turn. Go ahead.
well, in The Telling, the novel called The Telling, which is about some folks who are struggling to hold on to their culture and oral culture in the face of a kind of a state that wants to wipe it out.
It's a novel novelizing what Mao did to Taoism in China.
Right. Right. Well, that I know that's what provoked it, but it absolutely works for the story of so many indigenous societies, and there, you have a wonderful way of talking about the art of not being purist. One of the things I've learned from this indigenous model is no purism. You don't. No refusenickism. You know when to resist, but you also know when to give, and you know what to accept. You say you accept the new technologies, the new ways. If they work, we take them in. But it's an art of changing while still holding on to some thread, and it's an entangled, in some ways devious thread, but it's a real thread that's ancient. And that is coming through in these new circumstances, and that's, I think, what we could all learn from. And it's not some packageable wisdom that native peoples can, give to us.
Doesn't it always involve a sense of belonging to a people? And it's when that gets lost or destroyed that then the culture is lost, then the morale is gone. And this is kind of a big question for us, living in an enormous country like this. Who are my people? And I think it's very important to find out who your people are if you're going to survive and thrive in a difficult, changing world, right?
Right. Without virulent nationalism, we hope.
No, this has nothing to do with nationalism.
Without one more genocide. I want to, we're living 7-odd billion of us are alive now, and about 3.5 billion of those folks were born recently. I mean, we're all born recently, but I mean really very recently, and living in vast megacities. And I'm thinking of the indigenous of the Anthropocene, if we want to call it that, or the Capitalocene, which I prefer, as the born ones. It's both too big a story and not big enough, that there's a way in which there's a kind of folks are cobbling together lives in the slums around Lagos, and folks are cobbling together lives out of both, borrowed, stolen, remembered the skills and wisdoms, socialities. Folks in extraordinary dispossessions are of the indigeneities that Jim was enlarging, and also the indigeneity of being one of the born ones in the time of the late 20th century and on, when we're talking about a planet of, when I was born, it was like about 2 billion people. It will be about 11 billion at the end of the century if we're lucky. That's assuming birth rates remain low, et cetera. The born ones as the indigenous of the hot earth, and who are, in fact, creating ways of a great dispossession, amazing dispossessions from land, from all kinds of things. Kinds of wealth are being made, kinds of well-being are being made by and among the born ones. And I think there's a kind of a need to study what I'm crudely calling the indigeneities of Abdul Malik Simon called the city yet to come. There's a way in which we also need something, the poetries and the sciences of these indigeneities, the indigenous to the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene.
Hey, good evening, everybody, and thanks for a wonderful evening. Nice to meet all of you. I have a confession I'm greatly ashamed to make in front of all these people. I may be the only person in here who's never read anything by Ursula Le Guin, but Ursula, would you please give me a personal recommendation for the first or second or third thing, for top 3 maybe, or the top 1 that I should read, and I promise I'll do it. Thank you.
Try The Left Hand of Darkness.
Okay, now this side.
On the other hand, I think you're the only author I have a whole shelf in my library dedicated to. I've tried to name a daughter after you, but the damn sea witch hijacked the name. So now I'm working on granddaughters, and I'm extracting promises. But my question is, to your knowledge, have any of your social structures or plans ever been enacted? For instance, the interlocking spirals of Always Coming Home in the town design.
No. I guess in some ways I haven't encouraged that can become a kind of groupieism, which kind of worries me. So I'd rather people kept it in their imaginations and used it to make a real world with, rather than playing with my invented world.
Thank you.
Hi, Ursula. So the suggestion was that the question be very straightforward. Hi. And this is it. I loved all 3 of the things you read tonight. The quasi-academic essay, the piece you wrote, I think, just for tonight, and the poems. And I wanted to read them all again. And I'm wondering the best way to find the pieces you read tonight.
Well, the little author of the Acacia Seeds is in my collected short stories.
Which is titled?
I think it's in The Wind's 12 Quarters.
I'm sorry?
I think it's in the collection called The Wind's 12. Oh, no, it's in my new, The Unreal and the Real.
Buffalo Gal?
Yeah, okay, it's in Compass Rose, but it's in the...
Okay. It's called Acacia Seeds?
reprinted.
Okay. The piece you wrote for the evening?
That's a...
Is that something
occasional
that
piece. I
might
don't-
might the conference people post that?
Can we post it?
We'll talk
I
about
guess
We'll
so.
talk about it.
I'll have to, it's full of scribbles and scratches
Sure.
and stuff, so...
The movement from science to poetry was incredibly moving. That would be great to see that again. And then the poems that you read tonight, how are they finding?
Well, I hope that they will come out in my next volume of poetry.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And the last one I read, the Aphrodite, is coming out in Alicia Ostreicher's collection next year.
Oh.
Well, I'm very proud to be in that.
Is the Whiteness poem published?
No.
Okay. Thanks so much.
And while you're waiting, Ursula's Finding My Elegy, New and Selected Poems, is great.
Full of
Very
amazing
recent,
poems.
and half the book is new stuff. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm on the. First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be able to ask you a question and to hear you speak tonight. You've been a huge influence on my life, and I know probably a lot of people feel that way. But I don't have an intellectual, philosophical question. I really, if I may, I want to ask you a personal question. Of all the questions that I could ask you, the one I wonder the most about is intellectual property and how you feel about the Harry Potter series. And maybe people ask you that all the time, but you know, having read the Ursula trilogy and then read the Harry Potter series, I felt, and I'm sure everyone who does felt, that it was derived from your work, and I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, I guess if you've got to be an influence, I hope you're a good influence. What do you say? You know, writers do steal from one another. There's nothing. The Avatar actually was the one that I was a little. That was a fairly raw steal in some ways from my book. And Harry Potter, okay, School for Wizards, she sort of claimed, oh no, she never heard of any School for Wizards. But I don't know whether that's honest or not, but anyway, what does it matter? You know, School for Wizards is a good idea.
Nicely put.
Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for bringing this conversation with art, science, and feminism all together, in particular for me, as someone who has a background in arts and feminism. But my question is more about your poem on whiteness. I really enjoyed it, and it really made me rethink the temporality of the coloniality of power as it relates to the deployments of white supremacy and capitalism in our modern world. So for me, since you wrote that poem, I was wondering, what are some critical things that you think we should take away from whiteness and moving on in this current world in which colonialism and imperialism still impact us? So,
You know, it's a wonderful question, and it's the kind of question that I cannot address. And this is going to sound kind of weaselly, but you know, when I write a poem, I'm a poet, and a poet's. Okay, the unacknowledged legislators of humanity, Shelley said, you know. But you're not giving directions. You have no instructions. You, in a sense, you have no information. It's not an information technology, poetry. You are just trying to strike a spark. But what fire that spark lights is up to the person whose spark it is, you know. So I just have to sort of leave it there.
but isn't that art, though? Like, that is art. So thank you. That was a great answer. Thank you. I love that.
Hello. I am so honored to be here tonight, and I have a question about the Earth-Sea cycle and the way that gender roles progress in the Earth-Sea cycle, and your connection between women and dragons towards the end. And I see in the farthest shore the fear and the conflict in that book around death and the search for immortality. I see that in our use of technology and distracting that fear of death. And then in the Earth-Sea cycle, we have dragons as this healing force and a way to re-envision the world of the dead. And I'm curious if you could speak to how you see dragons and that relationship in our world today.
Oh, well, dragons today, yeah.
It's wonderful.
The question is kind of too big to handle in under about an hour. There's no anti-technology in Earthsea. That would be reading something in that I would be quite unaware of. That's just simple, plain fear of death. The dragons' relationship to life and death is never very explicit, never clear. And why women started turning into dragons in Earthsea, don't ask me. When you're dealing with material like that, you kind of take what's given you, and you try to make sense of it to the reader, but you don't try to interpret it. And I cannot. Now there are people who can they can tell me what I said in my book, and I say, yeah, I guess, yeah. But I'm not good at it.
So you answered that question about the way that massively successful pop
I'm sorry,
culture
could you start
films-
over? We were whispering.
We were consulting.
We were consulting.
You answered that question about how your work, your speculations, your ideas, your scenes have been ripped off and appropriated by other very successful pop culture forms in a very generous way by saying that writers always steal from each other. But it seems that what happens in all those appropriations, including Cloud Atlas, is a kind of flattening out and a moralizing and a simplifying of something that was in your original work very deliberately ambiguous and complex. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about the culture industry as such, and about a kind of work that is more, not only more ambiguous and ambivalent and unclosed, but also more artisanal and local and craft-based?
I can just say I agree with everything you said. Yeah, I mean, you got it.
Hi, thank you. My question is putting two different topics that you've mentioned this evening, the first being the rock and the perplexity for humans to imagine the history of what this rock has lived through. And then you spoke of your grandson and technology. And putting those two together, I'm wondering for your grandson, for any possible future children he may have, for future babies of your family, and future babies of all of our families, I guess, what would you like to be the rock of your voice that survives from generation to generation, that you would like to see passed down from generation in honor of you?
Oh, just the idea of actually making something that gets passed on is so huge and kind of it's a rather overwhelming idea. You know, if I'm just glad I can write stuff that means something to people now. And what happens? The one thing I hope doesn't happen is the thing that so often happens to women writers, is they sort of get silenced after they die. If you notice, that it's the men that, and women have to be sort of dug up again. And remember Willa Cather? You know, I hope we've stopped doing that. Mm-hmm. But that's a bit of a change of subject. Yeah.
Well, it's almost Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. And I have a question actually about your mother, which kind of follows from what you were just talking about. And what do you think was her main reason or goal for writing her book? And do you think she felt...
You mean Ishi?
Ishi, yes. Yeah. Do you think she felt that she accomplished what she set out to do? And what do you think she accomplished with that book? Well, she has lasted well beyond her life.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
She wrote the book in a sense. They of course, I asked my father to write the book, and he was pretty old then, and he never went back. He never reminisced, and he said, "No, I don't write books about my friends." And Robert Heiser, the anthropologist, said, "Well, maybe Mrs. Kroger would write the book." And so she took on that job, and it was very heavy job.
I'm sure it was.
And actually, in some ways, you know, there is an issue for children called Is She Last of His Tribe? But that was even harder for her because she was trying to tell this terrible story of genocide for 12-year-olds, you know. So she sweat blood over those books. She also enjoyed it enormously and discovered that she could write a biography, you know. And then she got the letters from people saying, I cried. Your book made me cry. And she was always so happy when she got those letters. So she wanted, that's what she wanted.
Please.
Hi, thank you all very much for being here and for taking questions. I have a question sort of about the broader Anthropocene topic that we're kind of here for, and it's sort of for everyone. I'd love to hear all of your voices if you're interested. There's a prominent, I believe, biologist named E.O. Wilson right now who's going on a book tour and kind of doing the whole circuit. And he was asked about the Anthropocene and how he feels humanity can sort of undo or repair or live with the damages that we've done. And he had this sort of interesting soundbite where he believed that technology got us into this problem, and so he also believes that technology is what will get us out of this problem. And it seems like kind of a fraught concept that I'd really love to hear you guys talk about.
That's what I was calling the techno fix, for shorthand. Yeah, but I would love to hear.
Well, stay tuned for Deborah Gordon in the upcoming conference, who, like E.O. Wilson, understands the order of the social insects, the basis of E.O. Wilson's great fatherly wisdom. By the way, I think E.O. Wilson has done some really important work for the love of the earth. But I do believe that he is, in the strict technical sense of the term, patriarchal, and that order comes from hierarchy. And Deborah Gordon's whole extraordinary biological work in exquisite detail understands the order, the worldings of this earth that work in quite other ways. Thank you. And that, in that sense, the technofix is another nightmare. It's a kind of wet dream of the father whose technology has failed. And we need a few dragons.
Enough said. To be honest, how much longer would you like to go?
Thank you all very much for being here. It's been an immense pleasure to listen to the conversation.
Okay, you need to start again because we were.
I'm just giving you gratitude.
I'll be honest. I'm sorry.
We'll stop muttering.
You should know, those of you in the line should know that we were discussing how much longer to go. I mean, you've taken a lot of energy and time from Ursula, so we're thinking 10 minutes?
Let's say
Till,
four more, two
yeah.
on each side.
Okay.
4 more
And
questions,
so
okay?
that's clear. And the guys at the back,
So,
apologies.
guys, yeah, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
Great. Okay.
Well, then let me give you what could be a big and provocative topic, which is to challenge the idea of living in a damaged world, because I would like to hear your responses to someone saying, what if that's not actually true, or what if that's not the best way to look at it, because it would crystallize for me what it actually means to say living in a damaged world, because I think what that is sort of getting at is that our scale in numbers and our ability through technology is so far beyond how we evolved and how the world has evolved around us. So our home that we value with everything that's built into us evolutionarily is not what it used to be, and it's changing rapidly. But maybe that's okay, and there's a way that we can value what we do have and lose certain things in the creation of other things.
Where to start? I guess I would need to know what evidence a person asking claiming that we were not in a damaged world, how would they pose the question?
Well, I guess saying you live in a damaged world posits that were humanity not here, there would be some serene place that was untouched, that we should strive to live in that world.
Donna, please.
I don't think it implies that, and I think the notion that somehow human beings are flawed and have been surpassed by our own technology and we're to get what we deserve, or, I think those are very unhelpful damaging stories. And when I say we live in a damaged world, I'm thinking of things like the rates of extinction of the critters on the earth, and the loss of ongoingness, not just of individuals, but of kinds upon kinds upon kinds, and that it doesn't have to be that way. One of the great insights of a particular branch of Marxism was that the established disorder is not necessary, and it's not some deep evolutionary flaw in human beings that we really can. The sky is falling, but has not yet fallen. Chicken Little, is still not the prophet here. And that not to understand the rate of loss and not to mourn the irreversibility of some of this loss. It has nothing to do with what we can perhaps keep or save or whatever. It's finally not altogether about us. It is really about the inhabitants of this world who are not all and not even mainly us, and how we all learn to get on together into some kind of thick present tense.
Yeah, amen to that. It's not about us.
Hi, thank you again for sharing this conversation and inviting us to share in it with you. I recently had the pleasure of reading your novel, Lavinia, which I found really marvelous.
Thank you for raising that.
Both for what it had to say about things like how indigenous people deal with a colonizing force, about humans' relationship to nature, to the world they live in, to poetry, and to their own past. And also, as a scholar and teacher of the classics, I found it deeply affecting and one of the most sensitive readings of Virgil I've ever come across. So thank you so much for that. And my question, very simply, is whether you have another project like that in the works.
Oh, I wish I did. I wish I could do something from Lucretius.
Yeah, and the poem tonight was a wonderful ode to Lucretius. So thank you.
Well, I'll certainly second that, and if you don't know about Lavinia,
Go read it.
Go read it.
Right after The Left Hand of Darkness.
it came out of nowhere for us, and it's really...
It came out of nowhere for me.
Yeah, but a lot of work. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you, Ursula, so much. You said that your hope was that you could spark something in somebody, and you have, very deeply, in so many of us. And my question is maybe too big, but about how the Tao Te Ching affected your perception, your writing, your view of life, your relationship to life.
How the Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu. Well, I read Lao Tzu ever since I was 14 or so, and it just became a way of looking at things that was endlessly nourishing. And so, the little poem I read, the Tao song, that this is sort of my understanding of the reassurance of this curious nihilistic philosophy. So it just got really deep into me, and so it's hard to talk about.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, this question is kind of prompted by the postulate of the Ansible, which has now become sort of a science fiction trope outside your work. But it's kind of a tangential question. Do you see any indications of a supramaterial, not necessarily theological, soul level to things, plants, animals, people, living systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
The soul is something extra, sort of?
It's not necessarily, it can't be detected physically. There's just a lot of smoke on the physical level.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. I don't know quite how to answer. Soul is a word I use because there isn't any other word.
Right.
To say whatever it is we're talking about, which may just be the togetherness of things, and
a field.
Yeah, but so yeah, you end up with words like soul, and you wish you didn't have to, but people know what you mean,
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
This is our last question.
Ursula, it's Jim Fanero.
Please talk into the microphone.
microphone.
Would you please talk into the
Actually,
microphone?
it's Jim Fanero. I just wanted to tell you I did get a chance to say hello.
Okay, that's it.
Well, wait a minute. Wait, I think we just owe Ursula Le Guin an astonishing debt of thanks. And